We have breaking news right now. The New York judge who rejected President-elect Donald Trump's argument that his criminal case should be thrown out over the Supreme Court's immunity ruling has ordered Trump to appear for sentencing on January 10th. His motion to dismiss the case has been denied. Trump was hoping to clear his record of those 34 felonies before returning to the White House. So Trump has been ordered to appear for sentencing on January 10th. Do we have CBS News political reporter and attorney Katrina Kaufman? There you are. Katrina, so happy you're here with us. Thank you for getting ready so quickly. What is the significance of this case? And we know that there are multiple criminal cases that were swirling in Trump's orbit. Some have been dismissed that were related to federal crimes he was accused of as it relates to special counsel Jack Smith. This is a separate case. Can you catch us up to speed?
Absolutely. I mean, the significance of this case is that it is the only one that went to trial where we got a jury verdict. This case made Trump a convicted felon. He is now the first former president who has ever been prosecuted and the first convicted felon to have been elected into office. And honestly, this is sort of a surprising decision. I think a lot of people were anticipating that Judge Merchan was either going to postpone the sentencing until after Trump's presidency, or potentially there was even a talk that he could do something that they actually normally do when someone dies, which is they close a case and basically leave the conviction and the indictment intact, but they never do the sentencing. So it's very interesting that Merchan has decided to move forward with this.
And Katrina, correct me if I'm wrong, but Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg did not oppose the idea of delaying sentencing until after his term.
That is correct. You're right. And he's actually the one who had proposed that idea of potentially even closing the case in this novel way that they've never done for a living person before, just in putting out different options for the judge. So the judge has made this decision. Trump, it said, can either, I haven't finished reading through this exactly, but can appear either in person or virtually on January 10th. That is 10 days before inauguration, Lindsay.
And so what are the different options that you are hearing from legal experts that you've been talking to about what Merchan may be inclined to dole out in terms of a sentencing? I mean, is it possible that the president-elect would face any kind of jail time over this conviction?
I mean, this is a really good question. Initially it did seem plausible. Trump is a one-time offender. He's also an older offender. So in that case, often jail time is not given. But it did seem possible at one point that he could be given maybe less than a year sentence in jail, maybe a few months. Now that he's been elected president, that seems extremely unlikely. I mean, of course, if there was any jail time, that would be a deferred sentence. But other possibilities are probation. There could be just a monetary fine. He could get something like community service, although, again, I cannot imagine that happening to Trump now that he's about to take office. So these are some of the options on the table, Lindsay.
And I know that we are completely in uncharted territory because of all the firsts that you mentioned. But Katrina, just to, again, catch people up to speed a little bit, when Merchan had said that this case wasn't subject to that SCOTUS ruling on immunity during official acts, he had said the evidence shown at trial pertained entirely to unofficial conduct beyond the scope of the Supreme Court's ruling. Can you just add to that on why Merchan said that this case did not fall in line with that ruling?
Sure. There are a number of reasons. One is that he said the conduct was personal. As you said, it was not official. This was related to repayments that were not part of his presidency at all. This was not part of the executive branch. And another issue here is that Trump's legal team tried to argue that some of the evidence shouldn't have been presented to the jury, that some of the witnesses shouldn't have taken the stand, and that was enough to throw out the conviction altogether. And what Judge Merchan said is that anything that came in that maybe potentially shouldn't have, that would have also just been harmless error. None of it was enough to overturn or potentially change what the jury decided in this case.
And based on conversations you and I have had and interviews that I've done with other lawyers like yourself, I mean, they have mentioned really the sanctity of a jury verdict, that judges are very reluctant to undo the will of the people. And in fact, in part of the judge's motion, he said, indeed, the sanctity of a jury verdict and the deference that must be accorded to it is a bedrock principle in our nation's jurisprudence. Given your legal background, can you expand on that a bit for us?
Yeah, and I think another thing that is significant here is Trump is also trying to dismiss this case on the basis of the fact that he was elected president. And a response by the prosecution to that is that, just because you were elected president after a jury made this decision, really, it's not the general public that can change the verdict. The jury is the only one who sat in that courtroom, who heard all of the evidence. So the fact that the public then decided to elect Trump into office after that happened doesn't negate what happened in that courtroom and, the job that these jurors took on in making this really significant decision.
You have mentioned several appeals from the former president. Can you please dive into what his legal strategy has been in terms of appealing and delaying, and how successful that strategy has been?
I mean, that really has been his core strategy, to delay, delay, delay. And it has been extremely successful. I mean, his two federal cases have now been dismissed. They were dismissed without prejudice, which is a very important distinction because they could potentially be revived later. In Georgia, I mean, that is sort of its own issue because of the prosecutorial team there. But this delay strategy has been extremely effective. I mean, even the fact that the DC case, for example, had to go to the Supreme Court, that whole presidential immunity process just delayed things so much. And now we're also seeing with the New York criminal case, it became very controversial that these decisions, the sentencing was originally set for right before the election in November, just by a couple months. Merchan decided to move it at that time because he didn't want to be viewed as potentially creating any influence on the decision that was made during that election. So we've really seen this strategy just butt up against the legal system. And now 3 of the cases against Trump are essentially gone. And there's really just this one left where we will soon get to see what Judge Merchan decides to sentence him.
For anyone who is just joining us, we are following breaking news because the judge in Donald Trump's Manhattan case, in which he was convicted of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, the judge Juan Merchan has issued a motion that Trump needs to appear for sentencing either in person or virtually on January 10th, 10 days before his inauguration. In fact, in part of his motion, the judge writes, finding no legal impediment to sentencing and recognizing the presidential immunity will likely attach once defendant takes oath of office. It is incumbent upon this court to set this matter down for the imposition of sentence prior to January 20th, 2025. Now, Katrina, we have been talking about what this means, what the judge could possibly do. We may reiterate some of that for anybody who's just joining us, but again, we need to remind everybody that the jury found Trump committed 34 felonies. This was in authorizing reimbursements to Michael Cohen, his former attorney and fixer, who paid $130,000 to adult film star Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election in exchange for her silence about an alleged sexual encounter with Trump. Trump denies all allegations, but can you please catch us up to speed again on this case and the specific counts that he was charged and convicted of?
Sure. The counts were related to falsification of business records, and they were elevated to felonies by also having an underlying crime. But, another aspect of what the prosecution really tried to hit home during that trial is that covering up this story about Stormy Daniels, keeping it from coming out, they felt could have potentially impacted the results of that 2016 election. So more than just the falsification of documents, they felt that it really could have had an impact on him being elected into office, that's what he was worried about. That's why he wanted to keep Stormy Daniels quiet. And sitting in that courtroom, the prosecution really put on a very, very strong case before that jury, where they made the really grave decision of convicting the first former president. They now have watched him be elected into office, and we are finally going to get to see this sentencing on January 10th. The judge has now decided to move forward with it. A lot of legal experts thought that this might get postponed until after Trump's presidency. Another significant thing to mention is that once Trump has been sentenced, he can then appeal this conviction. So something that could have happened if this got delayed even more is that Trump would have just been left with this hanging over his head while president as a convicted felon. He will now have whatever this sentence is, but he will be able to then move forward with that appeal process.
Katrina, stand by for us if you can as we continue to cover this breaking news. Let's bring in CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson. Jessica, your reaction to this breaking news. It looks like we lost Jessica's shot. Let's go ahead and see. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit of the conclusion of this motion from the judge, if we can see if we can get Jessica back. Part of it reads, therefore, the court finds that nearly the vacatur of the jury's verdicts nor dismissal of the indictment are required by the presidential immunity doctrine, the Presidential Transition Act, or the Supremacy Clause. So in conclusion, the judge is saying that neither the jury's verdict, the guilty verdict, or the dismissal of the indictment are required by the Presidential Immunity Doctrine, which is the Supreme Court case. Do we have Jessica back? All right, Katrina, let's go back to you. And if you can help us dissect the importance of one of those final clauses there in that conclusion from the judge.
I apologize. I missed what you were saying just there.
It's on page 18, the top part of conclusion, where it says, therefore, this court finds that nearly the vacatur, I'm guessing the vacating of the jury's verdict, nor dismissal of the indictment are required by the Presidential Immunity Doctrine, the Presidential Transition Act, or the Supremacy Clause. Can you translate that for us?
Absolutely. So part of the argument here is that there would be too much of an undue burden on Trump as he was in this transition period, as he entered the presidency, by having this sentencing take place. So they've been saying that it would go against policy, that it would be unconstitutional in the burden that it would place on Trump, Judge Merchan, and also that it would violate the presidential immunity ruling. But Judge Merchan has decided that this is not the case, that he is going to move forward with the sentencing before Trump's inauguration into office.
And just for everybody at home as well, as I continue to read this, so I had mentioned that Katrina had mentioned this, and I reiterated it, that Trump can either appear at sentencing in person or virtually, and that counsel is directed to inform the court of his preference no later than January 5th, 2025. Do we expect any other kind of legal challenge, Katrina, to this that could potentially push this back?
I mean, knowing Trump's legal team, there is always a challenge. So I would absolutely anticipate that they will try to push the sentencing. It has been pushed numerous times already. But given the fact that this is now bumping up on Trump's inauguration on January 20th, Judge Merchan has made this decision that he wants to move forward with the sentencing. And I would highly anticipate that we can expect this date to now stay in place.
So I want to go ahead, and of course, this information, Katrina, is coming fast and furious, as you very well know. But our colleague Graham Cates had sent an email out noting one particular passage that I'm going to go ahead and read. While this court, as a matter of law, must not make any determination on sentencing prior to giving the parties and defendant opportunity to be heard, it seems proper at this juncture to make known the court's inclination to not impose any sentence of incarceration, a sentence authorized by the conviction, but one the people concede they no longer view as a practicable recommendation. Can you understand? Can you help me understand what that means? Is that essentially saying that prosecutors aren't pushing for jail time, so it's not on the cards?
That is absolutely what it's saying. It's saying that, there could have been incarceration as a potential sentence for this, but their inclination is not to go that route, that the prosecutors are no longer trying to recommend this as the outcome of the sentencing. So the judge is clearly laying that out before we hit the sentencing date now.
So what does that mean in terms of options that would be at his disposal? I know that you mentioned a fine, community service. Can you please just reiterate what some of those options would be?
Sure. It looks like they're saying potentially there would be an unconditional discharge as the most viable solution. So that might mean that they will leave him with, no conditions on his sentencing. But there are, some of the options that I mentioned before are the possibility of probation. Of course, there was incarceration, although it seems very unlikely that that is going to be happening, given what we just read. There also are things like community service. I also don't see that happening in this case. And then there are monetary fines. So that is a possibility as well, although they would be rather nominal, especially for someone like Donald Trump.
Katrina, hang out with us because I believe that we have Jessica Levinson back. Jessica, CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor. Big breaking news here, sentencing January 10th. But as Katrina and I have been discussing, doesn't sound like the judge is inclined to oppose any kind of jail time. What is your analysis and reaction to this?
I think before the election, after the election, we're not going to see any jail time. Let's remember what type of conviction we're talking about here. We're talking about the lowest level felonies in New York. That doesn't mean that these aren't serious. It doesn't mean that they're not felonies. It means that we're talking about the lowest level felonies. And even if we were having a discussion, as you and I, Lindsay, have talked about Donald Smith as opposed to Donald Trump, I think what we all need to remember is it's not at all guaranteed that you would see any jail time. And again, I know this sounds strange to people because we're talking about criminal convictions. We're talking about felony convictions. Of course, you would have jail time. And the answer is not always. So I think for people who are watching at home, it feels like, well, maybe again, some people feel like this was just a politically motivated prosecution. Other people might feel like, well, here's the president of the United States again standing above or outside of the law. And I just want to situate all of us to say there was no guarantee of jail time for a conviction like this anyway. I think the reason that there was the greater possibility of jail time, frankly, is based on Donald Trump's behavior, the aggravating factor of going after the judge, going after the staff, of the way he conducted himself. But these are nonviolent felonies. And even before the election, I think there was not a big chance of prison time. After the election, almost zero chance of election time. Given the fact that the sentencing is happening on January 10th, a sub-zero chance of prison time.
Can you help us understand the judge's reasoning in scheduling the sentencing for 10 days before Inauguration Day and not, for example, waiting until after the completion of his next term?
So I think you need something extraordinary in order to say we're going to push this an entire presidential term. Now, look, delays are not unheard of. Certainly in the criminal justice system, sentences are delayed because there are medical issues, there are personal and professional issues. But delaying a sentencing an entire presidential term, again, you need to have a good reason for that. And I think the judge was just not convinced that that was there, that when you look at the interests of justice, there just wasn't enough of a reason to say we're going to wait 4+ years. In addition, and you may have already talked about this, forgive me, but the sentencing means that the clock for now Trump can continue with the appeals does not stop. He's sentenced, he's convicted, he's sentenced, he can appeal. And there are live appellate issues that are already being reviewed in this case. I mean, one of them is the theory of this case. And again, I don't know how much you've talked about this, but this was a pretty novel theory. The idea that business records and the falsification of business records could lead to felony convictions. And the theory was really that the business records were falsified in order to commit or conceal another crime. And the prosecution had kind of an interesting theory on what that other crime was. And they basically said it's campaign finance violations or it's tax law violations, but they did not require that the jury all came to the same conclusion as to what that other crime was. They just all needed to be convinced that there was another crime. All of which is to say, I absolutely think there are live issues on appeal here.
Can you help us understand what that would look like? I mean, is there a chance that his legal team could, and look, Jessica, you're the law professor here, not me, could appeal to the Supreme Court, put an appeal in and say, we need to stay on this sentencing while we're asking you to decide the merits of this, given that legal theory that was used as the basis for prosecution?
This is a great question. And everybody, I think, particularly when it comes to these, Trump legal issues, thinks, could this go to the Supreme Court? But let's remember that to go to the Supreme Court, you need a federal question. And when it comes to this case, we're talking about a state prosecution. And I think it is more likely that you would see an appellate issue go up to the state Supreme Court.